My entitled neighbor Karen had been cutting through my wheat field daily for months, destroying my crops to save 10 minutes. When polite requests failed, I introduced her to Brutus, my 1,800-pound Angus bull. Watching her Mercedes get chased across the field by an angry bull was priceless revenge. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The first time I saw Karen Mitchell's silver Mercedes SUV cutting through my wheat field, I thought it was an accident. Maybe she'd gotten lost, maybe her GPS had malfunctioned, or maybe she was having some kind of emergency. So I did what any reasonable neighbor would do. I drove over to her house that evening to politely let her know she'd damaged my crops and ask her to use the proper road next time. "Oh, that little shortcut?" Karen said, not even looking up from watering her perfectly manicured flower beds. "Yeah, I've been using that route for months. It saves me almost 10 minutes getting to the country club." I stared at her, wondering if I'd heard correctly. "Karen, that's not a shortcut. That's my wheat field. You're driving through my crops." She finally looked at me, her expression showing the kind of mild annoyance you'd reserve for someone who'd interrupted your favorite TV show. "It's just empty land, Robert. It's not like you're using it for anything important." "It's not empty land. It's a wheat field. Those are wheat plants you're driving over." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Whatever. Look, I pay good money to live in this neighborhood, and I shouldn't have to drive 15 minutes out of my way just because you decided to plant some grass in an inconvenient spot." That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with someone who'd made an innocent mistake. I was dealing with someone who genuinely believed that her convenience mattered more than my property rights, my livelihood, and basic human decency. Let me back up and explain how I ended up living next to the most entitled woman in rural Kentucky, and why her little shortcut was about to become the most expensive 10-minute time saver in history. I'd inherited my grandfather's 200-acre farm 3 years ago, and I'd been working hard to bring it back to profitability. Pop had been a wheat farmer his entire life, and he taught me everything he knew about soil management, crop rotation, and the delicate timing required to make a living from the land. The property was laid out in a long rectangle with my farmhouse and barns on the eastern edge, closest to the main road. The western edge backed up to a new housing development called Meadowbrook Estates, where houses started at $400,000 and came with names like the Charleston and the Savannah. Most of my new neighbors were decent people. They'd moved out from the city looking for peace and quiet, and they understood that living next to a working farm meant occasionally dealing with the smells, sounds, and sights of agriculture. But Karen Mitchell was different. Karen had moved to Meadowbrook Estates 6 months ago, purchasing what the real estate agent probably called the most prestigious home in the development. A massive colonial with white columns and a circular driveway that screamed, "I have more money than taste." The problem was location. Karen's house sat at the back corner of the development, and the only official way to reach it was to drive through the entire subdivision, past all the other houses, then wind around a series of cul-de-sacs designed more for aesthetics than efficiency. My wheat field, on the other hand, provided a direct route from Karen's backyard to the main road. If she could just drive straight across my property, she could cut her travel time from 15 minutes to 5. So that's exactly what she decided to do. For the first month, I only noticed the tire tracks occasionally. A line of crushed wheat plants running diagonally across my field, always in the same spot, always leading from the direction of Meadowbrook Estates to my farm road that connected to the main highway. I'd assumed it was kids from the development, maybe teenagers taking their parents' cars on joyrides. It was annoying but not frequent enough to be a major problem. Then I started seeing the silver Mercedes. At first it was maybe once or twice a week. Then it became daily. Then it became twice daily. Once in the morning when Karen headed to whatever rich lady activities filled her day, and once in the evening when she returned. Each trip carved a deeper rut through my wheat. Each passage destroyed more plants and compacted more soil. By the time I confronted Karen that first evening, she probably cost me $500 worth of crop damage. But after our conversation, things got worse. The next morning, I watched from my kitchen window as Karen's Mercedes came barreling across the field at what had to be 20 miles per hour, kicking up dust and wheat debris like she was on some kind of rally course. That evening she made the return trip even faster. I tried calling her. Her phone went straight to voicemail and she never called back. I tried leaving notes on her car. She threw them away. I even tried blocking her path with orange traffic cones. She drove around them, creating an even wider path of destruction. After 2 weeks of escalating damage, I drove back to Karen's house for a second conversation. "Look, I don't know what your problem is," she said before I could even speak, "but I'm getting really tired of you harassing me. I have every right to use that road. It's not a road, Karen. It's my wheat field. It's undeveloped land, and as far as I'm concerned, if you're not going to put it to good use, I don't see why I should have to suffer for your laziness. I felt my face getting hot. Karen, I've been farming this land for 3 years. That's not undeveloped land, it's a wheat crop that you're destroying every single day. Whatever. I talked to my lawyer, and he says that if you don't put up proper fencing or signage, then you can't claim exclusive use of the property. That's when I knew I was dealing with someone who was not only entitled but also completely divorced from reality. Karen had somehow convinced herself that my working farm was just an used land, that she had a right to drive through. But her comment about fencing gave me an idea. I called my insurance agent first, just to make sure I understood my liability and coverage. Then I called the county sheriff to report the ongoing trespassing and property damage. Finally, I called my old friend Jake Morrison, who ran a livestock operation about 20 miles south of my farm. Jake, I need to ask you about bulls. What kind of bulls, Rob? The kind that don't like strangers driving through their pasture. Jake laughed. Sounds like you've got a trespassing problem. Something like that. What would you recommend for someone who needs to discourage unauthorized vehicle traffic in a field? Well, legally speaking, you've got every right to fence your property and put livestock in any field you own. And if someone's dumb enough to drive through a pasture with a bull in it, well, that's what we call a learning experience. What kind of bull are we talking about? For your situation? I'd recommend Brutus. Jake went on to tell me about Brutus, a 3-year-old Angus bull who weighed about 1,800 pounds and had what Jake diplomatically called an assertive personality. Brutus wasn't mean exactly, but he had very strong opinions about his territory and very little patience for intrusions. The thing about Brutus, Jake explained, is that he's protective without being aggressive. He won't hurt anyone who minds their own business, but if someone comes into his space uninvited, he's going to let them know they're not welcome. Has he ever actually charged anyone? Oh sure. But he's smart about it. He'll run at you just long enough to make his point, then stop and watch to see if you got the message. I've never seen him actually make contact with a person, but I've seen grown men climb trees to get away from him. Perfect. The next morning, I drove to Jake's farm and met Brutus in person. He was magnificent, a massive black bull with intelligent eyes and a presence that commanded respect. When Jake led him around the pasture, Brutus moved with the confidence of an animal who knew he was the undisputed king of his domain. He's perfect, I told Jake. How much to lease him for a month? For a situation like yours? Let's call it a favor. I'll bring him over this afternoon. While Jake was preparing to transport Brutus, I drove to the hardware store and bought materials for a proper fence. If I was going to have a bull in my field, I needed to contain him properly, not just for Karen's safety, but to make sure Brutus didn't wander off and cause problems elsewhere. I spent the rest of the day installing a sturdy fence around the portion of my wheat field that Karen had been using as her personal highway. The fence was regulation height and properly marked with signs warning about livestock. Jake arrived at 4 p.m. with Brutus in a specially designed livestock trailer. We led the big bull into his new temporary home, and I watched with satisfaction as he immediately began patrolling his territory. Remember, Jake told me as he prepared to leave, Brutus is smart but he's still a bull. Don't go in there unless you absolutely have to, and if you do, make sure he sees you coming and knows you're supposed to be there. What about Karen? Jake grinned. Well, if she's dumb enough to drive through a clearly marked bull pasture, I'd say that's between her and Brutus. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning at 7:45 a.m., I was sitting on my front porch with my coffee when I heard the familiar sound of Karen's Mercedes engine. I watched as she came speeding across the field toward her usual shortcut route. What happened next was better than anything I could have imagined. Karen's SUV was about 50 yards into the field when Brutus spotted the intrusion. The massive bull had been grazing peacefully near the far fence, but the sound of the engine immediately got his attention. I watched Brutus raise his head, assess the situation, and then begin moving toward the Mercedes with the determined stride of a bouncer approaching a troublemaker. Karen, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was no longer alone in the field, continued driving at her usual reckless speed. That's when Brutus shifted into high gear. I've never seen an 1,800-pound animal move so fast. Brutus went from a casual walk to a full-speed charge in about 3 seconds, covering the distance between his grazing spot and Karen's projected path with the efficiency of a guided missile. Karen must have spotted him in her peripheral vision, because suddenly the Mercedes swerved hard to the left, kicking up a cloud of dust and wheat debris as she tried to avoid the charging bull. Brutus, for his part, seemed to be enjoying himself. Instead of stopping when Karen changed direction, he adjusted his own course and continued the chase, staying about 20 yards behind the frantically swerving SUV. For the next 2 minutes, I was treated to the sight of a silver Mercedes being herded across my wheat field by an increasingly enthusiastic bull. Karen's vehicle zigged and zagged like a rabbit trying to escape a predator, while Brutus maintained his pursuit with what I could only describe as professional determination. Finally, Karen managed to reach the edge of the field and escape onto the main road, her Mercedes disappearing in a cloud of dust and exhaust smoke. Brutus stopped at the fence line, watched her go, then turned and walked calmly back to his grazing spot as if nothing had happened. I was still laughing when my phone rang 10 minutes later. "This is Karen Mitchell, and I'm calling to tell you that your vicious animal just attacked me. I'm sorry to hear you had trouble with the livestock, Karen. Were you injured?" "Injured? I could have been killed. That monster chased me across the entire field." "That's strange. What were you doing in the field?" There was a pause. I was using the road." "Karen, there is no road in that field. That's a fenced pasture with clearly posted livestock warnings. You can't just put a bull in the middle of a public thoroughfare." "It's not a public thoroughfare, Karen. It's my private property, and I can put any legal livestock I want on my own land." "This isn't over," she yelled and hung up. But it was over, at least as far as Karen's shortcut was concerned. For the next 3 weeks, I didn't see hide nor hair of her Mercedes in my wheat field. Brutus spent his days peacefully grazing, occasionally looking up hopefully whenever he heard a car engine, but no unauthorized vehicles dared enter his domain. I thought Karen had finally learned her lesson. I was wrong. 3 weeks after the first chase, I was in my barn doing maintenance on my tractor when I heard shouting from the direction of the field. I looked outside and saw Karen standing at the fence line, waving a piece of paper over her head. Robert, get out here." I walked over to see what she wanted. Karen was dressed in her usual outfit: designer jeans, expensive boots that had clearly never seen actual farm work, and a silk blouse that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. "I have a court order," she announced triumphantly. "You have to remove that dangerous animal immediately." I looked at the paper she was waving. It wasn't a court order, it was a complaint she'd filed with the county about dangerous livestock threatening public safety. "Karen, this isn't a court order. This is just a complaint form. It's an official document. You have to comply." "No, Karen, I don't. This is just a piece of paper saying you're unhappy. If you want a court order, you'll need to actually go to court." Karen's face turned red. "Fine. I'll see you in court then. And when I'm done with you, you'll be paying for my emotional trauma, my medical bills, and the damage to my car." "What medical bills? What damage?" "I had to see my therapist twice because of the stress. And my Mercedes has scratches on it from all the dust and debris." I looked at Karen, standing there in her designer outfit, threatening to sue me because my bull had chased her out of my wheat field, and I realized something important. Some people are so disconnected from reality that they can't even recognize their own absurdity. "Karen, let me ask you something. Do you understand that you were trespassing on my property? Do you understand that you were destroying my crops? Do you understand that I had every legal right to fence my field and put livestock on my own land? I understand that you're a vindictive old farmer who thinks he can terrorize innocent people." That's when Brutus himself settled the argument. The big bull had been watching our conversation from about 30 yards away, and apparently he didn't appreciate Karen's tone. He started walking toward the fence, not aggressively, but with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he was coming to investigate the source of the shouting. Karen spotted him approaching and immediately backed away from the fence. See how aggressive he is? He's coming straight for me." "Karen, he's just curious about the noise. He's not even close to the fence." But Karen was already in full retreat, stumbling backward over her own expensive boots as she tried to get away from the bull who was still 20 yards away and separated by a sturdy fence. "This isn't over," she yelled as she practically ran back toward her house. "I'm calling my lawyer." As it turned out, Karen did call her lawyer. And her lawyer, after presumably listening to her story about being terrorized by a bull while she was driving through someone else's wheat field, apparently gave her some advice that she didn't want to hear. Because the next thing I knew, I received a phone call from someone identifying himself as Karen's attorney. "Mr. Johnson, this is Michael Stevens representing Ms. Mitchell. I understand there's been a dispute regarding livestock on your property. There's been a dispute about Ms. Mitchell trespassing on my property and destroying my crops. Yes, I've heard Ms. Mitchell's version of events. I'm calling to suggest that we might be able to resolve this situation without litigation." I'm listening. Ms. Mitchell is willing to pay for any crop damage she may have caused, in exchange for your agreement to remove the bull from the field adjacent to her property. I almost laughed out loud. Mr. Stevens, let me make sure I understand this correctly. Your client wants to pay me for the damage she's already caused, in exchange for me removing legal livestock from my own property, so that she can continue trespassing and causing more damage. There was a long pause. When you put it that way, it does sound somewhat unreasonable. Mr. Stevens, I'm going to give you some free advice. Your client has been trespassing on my property and destroying my crops for months. I have every legal right to fence my property and put livestock on my own land. If your client doesn't like sharing the neighborhood with a working farm, she's welcome to move somewhere else. I understand your position, Mr. Johnson. I'll convey your response to Ms. Mitchell. That was the last I heard from Karen's lawyer. But it wasn't the last I heard from Karen herself. 2 days later, I discovered that someone had been trying to lure Brutus away from the fence line with food. There were apple cores and sugar cubes scattered along the fence, clearly thrown from the direction of Karen's property. I called Jake to let him know what was happening. Rob, that's actually dangerous. You can make a bull sick feeding him the wrong stuff, and if Brutus associates people with food, it could change his behavior. What should I do? Set up a camera. If she's trying to mess with Brutus, you need to document it. I installed a trail camera that evening, positioned to capture activity along the fence line between my property and Karen's. What I saw on the footage the next morning was both infuriating and ridiculous. The video showed Karen, dressed in what appeared to be hunting camouflage, crawling commando style across her backyard toward the fence. She spent almost 10 minutes throwing various food items into Brutus's pasture, then crawled back to her house the same way she'd come. I saved the footage and called the county sheriff. Sheriff Williams, this is Rob Johnson out on County Road 47. I need to report someone attempting to poison livestock. Poison livestock? That's a felony, Rob. What happened? I explained the situation and offered to show him the video footage. Sheriff Williams arrived an hour later, watched the footage and shook his head. Rob, I've been doing this job for 23 years and I've never seen anything quite like this. This woman is either crazy or stupid, and I'm not sure which would be worse. What can you do about it? Well, technically she's not on your property, so it's not trespassing. But attempting to harm livestock is a serious crime. I'm going to have a conversation with Ms. Mitchell. Sheriff Williams was gone for about 2 hours. When he returned, he looked tired. Rob, I've had some interesting conversations in my career, but this one was special. Ms. Mitchell seems to believe that you put that bull in the field specifically to terrorize her. She's not wrong about that. Sheriff Williams grinned. I figured as much. But here's the thing. You have every legal right to put livestock on your own property. She has no legal right to trespass on your property or to attempt to harm your livestock. So what happens now? I explained to Ms. Mitchell that if I catch her trying to feed or harm your bull again, she'll be facing felony charges. I also explained that her best course of action would be to use the roads that are actually designed for vehicles. How did she take that advice? About as well as you'd expect. But Rob, I think your bull problem is about to solve itself. Sheriff Williams was right. The next morning I saw a for sale sign go up in Karen's front yard. Karen Mitchell moved out of Meadowbrook Estates 6 weeks later. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd taken a job in California and decided a change of scenery would be good for her. I kept Brutus for another month, just to make sure Karen was really gone and that no other neighbors had gotten any ideas about using my wheat field as a shortcut. But eventually I had to send him back to Jake's farm. How was his vacation? Jake asked as we loaded Brutus back into the livestock trailer. I think he enjoyed himself. He seemed disappointed when the entertainment stopped showing up. Jake laughed. Well, if you ever need him again, just give me a call. Brutus loves a good challenge. The wheat field recovered completely by harvest time. The ruts Karen had carved with her Mercedes filled in naturally, and the damaged plants were replaced by new growth. I ended up with one of my best harvests ever that year. The new family that bought Karen's house turned out to be wonderful neighbors. They had 2 young kids who were fascinated by farm life, and I enjoyed teaching them about agriculture and showing them around the property. Sometimes, when I'm out working in the field, I think about Karen and wonder if she ever learned anything from her experience with Brutus. I doubt it. People like Karen Mitchell don't usually learn from their mistakes. They just find new places to make the same mistakes with different people. But I learned something important from the whole experience. Sometimes the best way to deal with someone who refuses to respect boundaries is to set up consequences that make disrespecting those boundaries genuinely unpleasant. Brutus taught Karen a lesson that no amount of polite conversation or legal threats could have accomplished. He showed her that actions have consequences, that other people's property rights matter, and that sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about entitled behavior. And every time I drive past that section of my wheat field, I smile and remember the sight of a silver Mercedes being chased across the countryside by 1,800 pounds of very determined bull. Some lessons are best learned the hard way, and some teachers have 4 legs and very little patience for nonsense.